Hi folks, good evening, welcome. I invite you to, I'll give you a minute to grab a seat here. We'll get going in a bit. I believe there are some people online who are staring at a blank screen. Okay, you got a few minutes, we're good. Cheer me on. All right. Good evening. Welcome here. My name is Will Braun. Maybe I'll introduce myself a little bit more in just a minute. But why don't we start? I'd like to start with a bit of a blessing. Why don't we sort of let go of the activity of the day, or that which we can let go of, and be present here with one another. And I'll start with a prayer. And also welcome to the people online. We'll begin with a prayer here. We give thanks for the gifts of this day. We give thanks for the life that we have here. We give thanks for this land that we are on. And we give thanks for the other bits of land that are important to each of us in different ways. We're grateful to be together here tonight. We're grateful for the story that brings us here, and for those that have brought this story to us. Ask for a blessing on those who will be speaking tonight, especially Jonathan and Dave. Help us to be here in a good way, with good things in our heart and openness to hear. Amen. Again, my name is Will Braun. I'll be emceeing, I guess would be the term. I serve as editor of Canadian Mennonite magazine, which isn't exactly the hat I'm wearing tonight. I also live south of Morden, Mennonite West Reserve, Treaty 1 area, not too far from where some of the story that we're hearing about takes place. I'm going to ask Melanie to just give us a couple announcements to start out with.
Hi, I'm Melanie Neufeld, and I am one of the co-chairs of the coalition, Mennonite Coalition, for Indigenous Solidarity. And yeah, one of the ways that we have been working together is to promote this story, The Secret Treaty, but I also want to let you know of a couple of other things. So as far as the books that are being sold, you can get them over at Common Word, and our authors will be able to sign your book if you want at the end. And we are also raising money as a way to offer discounted books to schools as part of education and learning. So if you want to keep that in mind, that is one way you can give back to this project. The next launch will be in Steinbach, November 17, the Sunday at 2 o'clock. And so that will be our very last last launch. So I look forward to kind of wrapping it up and for all that David has offered to us in telling of this story. So I look forward to, hearing and sharing with you all and hearing your questions today. And the last item is on November 18, is a Monday night. The coalition is inviting all of us to think about, we've invited Sarah Augustine to be a part and remind us again of the collective work that we all have together as congregations, as individuals, and how do we respond to this call to reconciliation. And so Sarah Augustine will be joining us on Zoom that evening, and you can register with Mennonite Church Manitoba on the events page. So thanks all. It's good to have you.
Thanks, Melanie. So for tonight, we've got about an hour or so together, something like that. It might stretch on a little longer if people have a lot of questions. Jonathan Dyck will speak, and David Scott. I will introduce them in more detail in a minute, but I want to just take a couple minutes to set the stage a wee bit here in terms of talking about the Handshake Treaty, the secret treaty. I came across a little piece I wrote. I think I cut it out in a way that it doesn't have a date. I think it was 2006 or 2007. This is me writing. I grew up on the banks, me quoting myself, I guess. I grew up on the banks of the Dead Horse Creek in the heart of southern Manitoba Menno land. This is like Winkler-Morden area. I am proud, in the non-boastful Anabaptist sort of way, to call that place along the creek my home. Or it was my home then, now not so much. Dead Horse Creek did not always have that name, and waterways have a way of beckoning to the past. Often escaping plows, bulldozers, and developers, they are corridors in space and time, the rhythm of what was. So the Dead Horse Creek, as it is now known, features in English. It features in the Secret Treaty book. I imagine Manitoba's original inhabitants sitting beside the Dead Horse Creek back in the days of Genesis, perhaps, when it was newly named. I wonder which were their favorite spots. And I wonder if my grandfather, who settled there, ever wondered about those who had gone before. So for me, it's of great significance to hear stories from that area of early encounters between Mennonite people and Indigenous people, to hear stories about that creek upon which I grew up and many other people grew up. And we all have those, or most of us have those little bits of land, those places that are of particular significance, often very deep significance. And often the beauty and meaning of those places is sort of intertwined with a complicated history too, and that's sort of where we're, part of what brings us here. In terms of how this book came about, this story, I'll keep that short. At one point, several years ago, I was sitting on Dave Scott's porch on the way home from a camping trip, and he started talking about this treaty, handshake treaty between Mennonites and Ojibwe people. I'd never heard about this. So it's the kind of thing where you don't get the whole story at once. You're like, okay, we're going to circle back to that at some point. Jonathan heard Dave talk about it elsewhere. One thing leads to another. A group of 15 or 20 of us went out to Swan Lake in February of 2023 to spend an afternoon with Dave to hear this story. We're gonna take time, bring some food, eat, and we want to hear this story. So some people in this room were there. And then out of that, Jonathan was chosen, appointed, volunteered to tell the story in his way. So Jonathan Dyck is, as some of you know, many of you know him better than I perhaps, illustrator, artist, author, etc., who grew up in that area, like Winkler-Morden area, close to the Dead Horse Creek. Graduated from this school right here. His work as an illustrator has appeared in the Walrus, Globe and Mail, Canadian Mennonite magazine, and elsewhere. And his book, Shelter Belts, was Book of the Year here in Manitoba a couple of years ago. What year was that? 2022. Okay. So Jonathan brings skill to this work, but also the heart and also the connection to the land. So think that covers the bases I was going to cover. Why don't you talk first, and then I'll do a separate introduction for Dave. It's going to be a long introduction, Dave. It's going to be flowery.
You did the way I expected.
It's good. Okay. Jonathan.
Hi, everybody. I've got my presentation is written out, but I'll try to keep it as fresh and lively as possible. Thanks for being here tonight. I'm going to give you a bit of background as to how I came to this project and just kind of some sense of what it means to me to work on something like this. I first met Dave at the Harvest Moon Festival several years ago. I learned quickly that Dave's a bit of a regular at the festival. He was there giving a presentation on reconciliation, and I stayed after to chat with him. That's where he first mentioned to me that there were stories of Mennonites in his people's oral histories. I wanted to know about the land where I'd grown up. More specifically, I wanted to know about that land outside of the familiar settler colonial framework that I was so used to hearing about. I'd become interested in Mennonite history, and I'd started to peel back the layers to help make sense of how my ancestors came to this place. But I knew that our accounts of this history was insufficient. Not only was it incomplete, it tended to be somewhat self-interested, a story of a people's suffering, hardship, and eventual triumph, at least where agriculture and industry were concerned. For much of my life, these preoccupations with business and farming have defined the southern Manitoba landscape. Rarely had I ever considered how radically that landscape has changed in a relatively short period, and the colonial conditions that made that transformation possible. As Will mentioned, I spent much of my childhood on a farmyard between Morton and Winkler, a mile or so south of the Dead Horse Creek. It was the same yard where my dad grew up, and his father bought a half section of land there in the 1950s that's now part of a much larger operation that's run by my cousin. The story that we tell in my extended family is one of transformation. At the time my grandpa purchased it, the land was not considered desirable. The open fields of silty soil meant regular dust storms and constant wind erosion. Through the planting of shelter belts, my grandpa and his family protected the land. They increased its productivity, and we're told, made good on its potential. In the oral histories Dave has shared, he speaks of lines on the ground, border lines, property lines, ways of carving up the landscape that control movement. Lines that tell us what is valuable and ultimately what is meaningful. These lines structure our lives in all kinds of ways, often preventing us from seeing what is right there in front of us. Growing up, I learned almost nothing about the area around me prior to the arrival and settlement of Mennonites. It was as if the place existed outside of history. And that vague sense of place seemed to suit the conventional story of Mennonite arrival in Manitoba. No one wanted this land, and look at what we've done with it. So as I'm sure many of you know, this year marks the 150th anniversary of Mennonite arrival in Manitoba. And some of my ancestors were on those first steamships that arrived at the confluence of the Red and the Rat Rivers. Mennonites have told and retold our history in this land with familiar tropes. We acknowledge the pioneering Mennonites who struggled in those first years. We express our gratitude to the Canadian government for granting Mennonites privileges like block settlement, military exemption, and control over education, short-lived as it was. We celebrate Mennonite industry and economic prosperity. And in all of this, at least traditionally, Mennonites have seen God's hand at work, protecting his people, ultimately rewarding them for their faithfulness. But we know that these tropes are also part of a larger forgetting. This is a deeply storied land. It is Indigenous land. And regardless of our backgrounds, we can't understand our presence here without recognizing the cultures and the lifeways of the Ojibwe, Cree, Dakota, and the Métis, who have their own storied relations to this land, who began resisting the destructive forces of colonization before Mennonite villages started to dot the landscape. History isn't inevitable. The story of the Secret Treaty is a story of how things could have been different. Some of us are only beginning to understand the larger context of settler colonialism and environmental apartheid that made Mennonite settlement here possible and desirable for the Canadian government. As we know, Mennonites were not the only European settlers in the southern Manitoba area. There were conflicts over resources, over timber, land, and waterways right from the get-go. But through mass migration, block settlement made possible by land reserves on either side of the Red River, the East and West reserves, Mennonite settlers came to dominate the landscape, geographically and economically. Stories like the Secret Treaty can direct us to ask questions that these early Mennonite settlers were discouraged from asking. What does it mean to live here on Indigenous land alongside Indigenous people? How can we reorient ourselves to the land and to our neighbors in ways that don't simply serve our own interests, but are mutually beneficial for each other, for the land and for future generations? I see this small book as an invitation to relationship, to the larger work that settlers need to undertake on the way to right relationships with Indigenous people. Part of that work is retelling some of our stories together, not in isolation. And I'm hoping that this book is just the beginning of that endeavor. Thank you very much, and looking forward to hearing what Dave has to say.
David Scott is not the easiest guy to introduce because he doesn't have a neatly defined title like chief or professor or anything like that. He doesn't have fancy letters before or after his name. No university degree. No honorary doctorates. No? Okay.
Don't insult.
But there are other things to say. David's from Swan Lake First Nation, which is in like an hour and 3/4 that way from here. I guess that doesn't help those of you watching on the screen. In south central Manitoba, more or less, Ojibwe Nation. He's worked in many capacities with many First Nations, nations and organizations across the country. He's got lots of stories to tell, colorful stories about encounters with prominent politicians, provincially and federally. He's got experience in environmental sorts of matters, beavers, birds, and all other animals and plants, language, Ojibwe language, farming as well, domestic animals, and then history and oral history as well. And in addition to that, I think it's important to say that he's also a spiritual leader in his community, an elder in that way. And the thing that I think about is that really impresses me is that Dave knows his neighbors. He knows my neighbors too. I live an hour away. But he knows like the Hutterites. He's in the schools, the churches, been so many different places. So what I really admire is that spirit of being an ambassador, of being open, of being willing to cross those lines that divide and meet people and listen to people and talk and so forth. I want to say one other thing, which is to just to acknowledge, in addition to like the story of this handshake treaty comes from Dave, but that's just the most recent sort of version. So in the book, he acknowledges some people. I'm just going to read these names of the people that are acknowledged from whom this story came. So John Swain, who heard it from his father, Mike Swain. Marie Gordon, who heard it from Joe Walker. Don Daniels, who heard it from Sam Cameron. And Dave's father, who heard it from his grandfather, Walter Scott. These are the saints who have gone on, and we owe a debt to them. The other thing, the last thing I would say about Dave is, in addition to knowing about farming and beavers and politics, he knows a piece of Mennonite history that none of our Mennonite historians know. And that's the story that he shares with us tonight. And I feel so indebted that you have come forward with this story, and you've been so willing to share it so generously in so many settings, including here. That is a great gift to us, and for that we are indebted. Please help me in welcoming Ambassador Dave Scott.
Wow. I feel like Justin Trudeau. But maybe a little more willing to talk to those that come before him. He doesn't like me, that boy. So thank you, Will, Jonathan, for inviting me again, and all of you for coming. The history of our people has not been told. It includes the history of all people who have come here. Everybody that we met, there's a history of our interactions with all of those that came here. The secret treaty, it's deliberate in its intent. It was illegal for white people to directly contact indigenous people or have any kind of dealing with our people. It was also shameful. It was also against Christian beliefs. When the British government was trying to get immigrants to come over here, they gave us an awful lot of bad names. Devil worshippers, heathens, pagans, savages, wild red men, all of these things that happened before any of you ever got here. This is the history of the British Crown and its relationship with our people in this area. I will tell you that we were not the first occupants of this area. It was the Cree people under treaty that brought us here, the Ojibwe people. And we kind of hung around after that. The Crees moved more to the north to trade with us over fish, and the Dene people as well, and the Assiniboine people. So these people were all here when we came here. The Ojibwe people are woodland people. We're not prairie people. But when we came here, one of the treaties that we made with the Cree people that were here was not just for our army, but for their knowledge about how we survive on this open prairie. It's something that we didn't know anything about. It's likewise with you came here. When your ancestors came here, you didn't know much about the area. By that time, we had developed quite a skill in understanding the environment, the valleys, where snow piles up, where snow falls, all of those things, how animals behave. Those things we developed because somebody else taught us those things as well. It's the same thing with this treaty. That was its intent, to live together in peace and to learn off of one another. You brought new skills to our lands here, and we wanted to know. We knew there was things coming ahead of us, things that we didn't understand. We knew there was something coming, and it was going to change our way of life. The one thing about the secret treaty was that it was about the sharing of land. It wasn't about the confiscation of land or the displacement of our people. That's not what our treaty was about. It was about to share ideas, to support one another in times of need. to learn from one another, to care about the land. All of those things were in the discussions during the treaty that was made between the Mennonites and the Ojibwe people. The names were a little bit confusing at the beginning, but I've since been doing quite a bit of research in trying to nail down specific things. The problem we have with that is we don't measure time in terms of calendars, days, time, 6 o'clock. When you got hungry, you went and ate. You didn't wait till 6 o'clock, right? You didn't do things like that. So we measure time differently, and that also adds to the complexity of telling these kinds of stories. I've been trying to write a book for about 15 years now. And every time it goes out to editors, it comes back, and I don't know who wrote that book. Our stories don't work like that. And trying to get these stories out, it was just by accident that Will got nosy with me one day, and I told him the story. The opportunity for Ojibwe people, or any other people, to tell about the history of their ancestors is very limited. Languages are a problem. My first language is the old Ojibwe traditional language, not the Soto that we use today. But I do speak Soto as well. So understanding that language and its connection to the people that brought it forward and taught me is incredibly crucial in understanding the stories that we have to tell. The deliberate hiding of Ojibwe or indigenous history in this country goes on today. It's still happening today. The other thing that's happening today is a lot of our elders, our storytellers, are gone now. In my reserve, we just lost 3 of them, 3 of my Ojibwe speakers. There's only myself and a couple of others left in my reserve that know the old Ojibwe language. And that's where those stories lie. And it's important that you get it from the original story. The names that Will said were about knowing where exactly these stories come from. That's an important thing when we're doing oral history, because that's how it is with us. We didn't write things down. You use the memories of your elders or the storyteller to get these stories across. Just to cover some of the background here, Wazawigwan, Chief Yellowquill, lived between 1827 and he died at Indian Gardens in 1910. That was the original chief that signed Treaty 1 here for our people at Swan Lake. Kichinika, the one who made the treaty with the Mennonites, Big Goose is his name, he was born in 1810 and lived to 1889. Shewe Ashik, the wife of Big Goose, which back in those days we had a matriarchal society, so it was the woman that told the man what to do. It was the woman that told Big Goose to make treaty. It wasn't another man. That's not the way it worked. Shewe Ashik lived between 1829 and 1909. Mijakibinas, Walter Scott, the one that is mentioned here, is my grandfather. He was born in 1857 and lived till 1965. He died in the house that I was raised in. He was 108 years old. And I know his stories handed down from my grandmother, my father. They all knew Mijakibinas' story because he was the oldest one that came forward from all the ones that have passed in the early 1800s. John Swain, the late John Swain, was a valuable resource for me when I was telling these stories, with him telling his stories and where they came from. And his father, who was a translator for the Ojibwe people in our area. John Swain lived between 1926 to 2017. The late Joe Walker, who Marie Gordon interviewed in 1971 and told his story. He lived from 1895 to 1979. My dad lived from 1914 to 1979. Marie Gordon, 1935 to 2003. There were 3 different societies within our culture, and their responsibilities were directly with land. The Grass Dance Society was the ones that made treaty with the Mennonites. Their responsibilities was in the open prairies and around the Altona area and Winkler areas as well. So that would have been his territory and his responsibilities. The Medewan Society would have been around the Steinbach area. Their responsibilities were scrublands and wetland areas. The Sundance Society would be in the woodlands, up along the escarpment and out into the wooded areas of the west of the escarpment would have been our responsibility. I'm a Sundancer myself. I'm not part of the Grass Dance Society. My brother is. So there are stories. In order to understand what these stories are telling, you need to understand what those societies' responsibilities were for. So when you say Grass Dance Society, the people of the Grass Dance Society, that's a pretty loose way of translating that word. We call it Mashkosi. It was actually, their responsibility was open grasslands. Animals that lived there, particularly birds, were one of the things that they worshipped. So that was why that particular part came into being when Kichinika, Big Goose, ran into the Mennonites in the open prairie around the Altona Winkler area. Some of the words that we used, one of the words in our language is Mishidun. But there's other words that were described to people we met. Kashashaganisdewat, barefooted people, and then there was Kagidimagdiwat, the persecuted ones, which we now know are the Mennonite people. And probably we had that last conference we had, what was it called? Subject, citizen, well, anyway, it was over at the U of W. I stayed the whole conference. I wanted to learn how exactly your people came here. So it was really eye-opening, and I want to thank all of those people that came and visited me and talked to me about their story. They were coming to ask me about mine, but I was more interested in them to really round out the information that we're putting out there. So Kichinika was, he was, for lack of a better word, we'll call him a war chief. He was in charge of the army, and the Ojibwe people came here with a very, very large army. That's why we ended up here. We were mostly a woodland people out from the Sault Ste. Marie area, and some of the things that we traded in terms of making the treaty with the Cree people was the teepee. We were not a prayer people, so the teepee was one of those things that they shared with us because it's far better than a wigwam. Wigwam were wood structures that you left in the ground, and that. So the teepee, I always think that an old man actually told me this. He says, "Well, that was our first RV." Because you could hitch it up to your horse and throw all the kids in there and away you go, right? So that was, just thinking about that idea. We were invited here, but we weren't just thrown out there to figure our way out. This is the purpose of treaty making and relationship building. So that's what we were dealing with. And that was the expectation of all those that have come to this land. Kichinika sat on a hill south of the city of Morden, and he said these words, "They have taken our lands that we have tried to save for our children and for the children yet unborn." Those words are crucial in understanding that we don't think of things in terms of myself. We always think of the kids that are going to be here later, way after we're long gone. So that's what these kinds of treaties were all about. And there are hundreds of these kinds of treaties. It just happened that Will tripped into this one, right? And it's a story that I've been wanting to tell for many, many years. I've been wanting to tell the history of Ojibwe people in this area for decades now. I worked for 48 years with my reserve and the organizations that represent Indigenous people in this country. But my passion has always been the teachings of the old people of my community. Can I get some water? So that's part of that necessary understanding to really fully understand where these stories are going through. So the story, the measurement I use, I'll say, what's it called? Standards that I use is 4 people telling the same story. And it's usually just in a general location, but I must use 4. If I only hear 3, I don't use the story, right? So it's important that these stories, and you know where that story comes from. And that's why I gave you the dates of when these people lived. It's important because that's our measurement, and then specific events, right? We now know that Kichinika made the treaty with the Mennonites in the spring of 1875, 1 year after the Mennonites got here. And they did, one of the old fellas said, he was laughing they were taping him, reel-to-reel tapes. And he says, they were so scared they had to chase him down, hold him to the ground, and tell him that you don't have to be afraid of me, right? Which is quite, it was deliberate, right? That's what they learned. That's what they learned. That's what they were told before they came here, that there's these scary people there, right? So these stories came out in that way, and our people are funny. They say, they use humor a lot. So that was one of the stories. So under the Indian Act, a person was defined as anyone other than an Indian. It wasn't until 1960 that we became full citizens of this country. I was born in 1960. I was born a citizen of this country, but a person under the Indian Act. And I still am that way. I still am a citizen of this country, but a person under the Indian Act. That still happens. When you talk about that, there's no mention of treaty. There's no mention of treaty at all in defining who I am as a person in this country. There's no mention of treaty. The basis of all of our relationships has been about treaty. The expectation of one another that we will live together in harmony and in peace. That was one of the big things that Ojibwe Ashik said. They're not going to raise an army against us. You go over there and you treat with them. That's what that lady told his husband, Kichinika. Kichinika, by the way, was my great-grandfather. That's my mother's grandfather. So it was the women that made treaty with people, but it was the men that had to go and do the hard work of identifying those things. And no man could ever ratify a treaty unless the women said, yes, it's a good treaty. The breaking up of the secret treaty was because of land, because of the allocation of land and the creation of the reserve system. Make the connection between an Indian living on an Indian reserve as rather than a person who is treaty with the federal crown. There's no mention of that anywhere. So we're still Indian Act people in this country. The land that was allocated to us, which we tried to reserve for ourselves, was put into the reserve system under the Indian Act. The story of the lines on the ground was told in 1817 when they were declaring the 49th parallel as Canada-US border. A big council was held at Dead Horse Creek, what you call Dead Horse Creek. Now we call that Saskatchewan. A council was held there, and there was hundreds of people there, hundreds of Ojibwe people, and they were discussing the seriousness of drawing lines on the ground, something we didn't understand. And the story came out that these lines will eventually imprison us and will imprison themselves, is the story. That's how that story goes. So if you go back to that time, where there wasn't a lot of people around other than from the east, more to the east. Mostly this was fur trade areas and stuff like that. So the authority of the British Crown at that time was already on our doorstep when they declared the 49th parallel as the United States-Canadian border. Our brothers and sisters in the United States, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota areas, all had the same concerns that we had. And when they came across the line to come and discuss the lines on the ground, was a warning. They're going to do this. It's lines we cannot see, and only the person who drew the lines knows where they are. Probably you don't know exactly where what's it called? The lines where you belong there. Property lines. Most of us don't. We just build our fences anywhere and just hope the neighbor doesn't get mad at us. Might be different in a city. Yeah, so I was raised a traditional person by my grandparents and my parents and the many old people of my community. And all those people were traditional people. I never had a cultural break from my people. All of my older brothers and sisters did. Some of them went to residential school or they went to Catholic school. I didn't. I went to public school and I came home every night. And I scarcely remember a day where I was not with one of the old people of my reserve. They put me on a path of knowing the history of our people. In 1976, I told the chief, I just had got a new job with the chief and council. I was 16 years old. And I told the chief and the band administrator, I want to go to the university. The chief said, give me a second. And then he went and got a bunch of all the old people. And they were all sitting around on the front lawn. And then they called me out. They said, not you. You can't go to those schools. It'll change the way you think about who you are as an Ojibwe person. So I never had that, not formally anyway. I snuck into universities. If I knew this was around, I probably would have snuck in here too. But I snuck into all the universities, Manitoba, Winnipeg, and Brandon. I wasn't interested in the grades or anything. I just was interested in the tools. I still need to survive in this world. So that was what I did. And it's important to understand, I mean, we can use elder, whatever words we use, but to me, they're my old people. They were my teachers. They were all traditional people. Their stories come from their life experiences. And, of course, the teachings of their ancestors, the ones that came before they did. And that's how these stories come out. The one story When I started working in and around the Morden area with the Mennonites there, and some of the churches around the Cartwright area, I think that church is gone now, I started seeing an opportunity to tell a big part of what happened in the area that we share today. And thanks to Will and Jonathan for allowing me to tell that story, because it needs to be out there. We need to develop a better understanding of one another, to respect each other, and to trust one another. We need to do that more and more. A lot of us are getting old. We need to teach our young people that these things happened way before they came along. So we need to share those ideas about what's happened on the land that we live on today. The first law of my people, of the Ojibwe people, is to look at people as human beings first. It's the teaching of Ibimadezi is what we call that. People as human beings first, not the color of their skin or what God they prayed to. The Christians that came here, their gods were far more important than our gods, and it was deliberate that ours be destroyed. It was very deliberate. All the named places around the Morden-Winkler area that we knew are gone now, and that was a deliberate act. The erasing of indigenous history in this country goes on today. It's only a few reserves that really think history is important that are making headway in getting their stories out to the general public. We are starting to hear these stories more and more. In our area here in Manitoba, there's very little. There's very little out there. And this is one of those stories that I think is critical, is a critical first step in doing more stories such as this. The details of the secret treaty, we're getting a good handle on that now, what was actually said. And I think I forget the guy's out. Anyway, there's a guy that was actually the translator. He was a buffalo hunter, which we call Métis today. We call them buffalo hunters. So he was the one that, language was one of those problems that we had, right? Because of the German sounding words. Translation was gruff. Whereas in British language, we called it sharp talking, or something sharp in your mouth when you're speaking. So the language of the German people was different from that, and that was one of the ways that we were able to recognize that these are not British people, right? It's the same thing with the French people. The sounds, for us, sounds are far more important than actually how you're saying words. If it sounds the same, then we know we're pretty safe territory. And it's crucial that we do that. I mean, we live out on the land. You have to know what's coming through that bush. If it's a deer or a bear or a Mennonite, you got to know. Right? So you got to know those things. So that's the way it is. Colonialism has deep and very stubborn roots. I've struggled with this concept all of my working life to bring people of this land from colonialistic paternalism to a more balanced understanding of one another. It's crucial that we do this now. Too much has gone by, and we start mistrusting each other more and more and more. It just keeps building up. So my work in the last probably 25 years has been to directly go out and meet our neighbors and tell them that we're not the boogeymen that your ancestors thought we were. And it's been my life's work, all of my working life, to collect these stories and to share them with whomever wants to hear them. It's only now that these doors are opening to these kinds of stories. And this is traditional oral history. This is not something you studied in an encyclopedia or somewhere in a library somewhere. There is a reason why this was secret. Because the British Crown made them secret. It made us to be bad, bad, bad people. And everybody believed it. And they made our gods less gods than your gods. I know there's a lot of people out there, our people, who are running around pushing spirituality down your throats. I don't like that. That's not something we should be doing. We didn't appreciate it when it was happening to us. So when I do my talks, I leave that aside. My spirituality is an extremely personal and private thing, so I don't share that with anybody. I can nibble around the edges as long as my grandfather doesn't catch me. I think I can get away with a little bit. So when we work at this kind of work and getting these stories out, and this has just been amazing what's been happening since we got this story out there. The amount of events that I have to go to, it's not even with all Mennonites. I'm being called to all different school divisions. I'm now working with 5 school divisions to work on their histories. We have stories of everybody that came here. We didn't run around making treaties with everybody, but we made some pretty significant treaties. But that was destroyed by the creation of the reserve system and the implementation of the Indian Act. How am I for time? Are you sick of me already?
The online people will tune out in about 10 minutes.
Hey?
A few more minutes,
Okay.
then we have time for questions.
The laws and the history of this country and the belief systems that came to our shores have prevented our peoples from living together in harmony. They have prevented us from looking at one another as human beings and speaking to one another's communities directly. Despite this history, it is my hope that our peoples, all of our peoples, take seriously this opportunity to resolve the difficulties we face. One of these key issues is the spirit and intent of treaties alongside its results. Sharing the land and the abundance with those that came here with nothing but the clothes on their backs and in need of our assistance to exist was a responsibility our people took upon themselves. I'm going to end my talk here with a quote from Chief Yellowquill. Chief Yellowquill rose at treaty time. He said, "We ask that you do not repeat the mistakes of the past. Do not assume that our willingness to accommodate you is a sign of weakness. We are the same kind-hearted people that you met when you walked onto our mother. We will do right by you because we respect life." Thank you. Okay, I'm done? All right.
I think most of these Common Word book launches are about 45 minutes to an hour. And thanks to Common Word for accommodating this, making it happen. I will say for the folks online, if you want to purchase a copy of the Secret Treaty book, it is available at Common Word. I'm pretty sure it's .ca. You'll find it. Why don't we take a few minutes for questions? And I think that the tendency is to go to the details and the facts, and that stuff's good and important. But I also wonder, like, what does this shake loose, sort of deeper within you? Where does it land with you? How does it connect with other experiences in your life? So why don't we have, questions, response, let's call it response. There is a microphone there, and I guess for the benefit of everybody in the room and people online, if you could use the microphone, that would be great. And I think we'll sort of Do we end it for the people online and then keep going for people in the room? I'm not sure. Somebody will make a decision about that at some point. Welcome. Any response? Other comments for Jonathan or Dave or both?
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed this. This was very important. I have a question. I've been actually studying intensively since the spring covenant making.
Can you speak a bit louder?
Yes, covenant making. The hidden treaty, because I just came to the point to ask myself the question, what is the difference between a covenant and a treaty? So basically you answered it today. Treaties are written, covenants are not. Covenants are made between people orally and with promises, exchanges of gifts, and always the help of each other. This sounds to me it's a covenant and not a treaty. Now I understand you're calling it the hidden treaty, but just for clarification, that to me sounds like covenant making and not treaty making. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that question.
Maybe in your language you express it more as a covenant. Grace covenant is what I found is it's called grace covenant making and not
Okay.
treaty making.
Firstly, I don't know what covenant means. That's not a word that I know. Treaty is a translation of what our language calls a treaty. In our language, we say agobizuin, to bring into the family. That's what that means. I'm not sure what covenant means. I think I watched a show on it. Is that what that means?
That's exactly what covenant means, because in covenant you always bring in the other side into the family, and specifically there are traditions of selecting specific family members
okay.
to exchange with the others. That is covenant making.
Okay, good.
That is
now
not
I
treaty
understand.
making.
So you guys should have been over here, right?
I'm
You should have been over here with me.
I'm sorry, this is
No, that's good. That's a good point. I never heard that word.
I've been
in this
studying,
context
I've
before.
only come across it in a class online in the spring, in March, and I've been trying to understand this. So this is new to me as well, but it is clearly covenant making.
Okay, good. I did hear that word once. What was it now? It was during the fur trade era. And it was a translation of one of the old people that talked. He says, when we broke the covenant, our covenant with the animals, the plants, and the environment, our lives went into a hole, right? That's the language that was used by some of the old people who could speak English back then. But I did hear that word. That just triggered a memory for me, that it was a covenant. I guess is covenant stronger than treaty? Is it? It kind of sounds like it, eh?
It's very different. It's substantially different.
Okay.
It's really
Now, are you using covenant in terms of Christian?
I've been researching it, pre-Christian.
Okay.
Hebrew Foundation
Ah,
as the Hebrew tribal people.
okay.
That's covenant.
Okay, that's a good question. I'm gonna think about that one.
It's very different. But from what I've studied so far, with handshakes, with oral tradition, with oral agreements,
Yeah.
promising for children and grandchildren and goes through the generations, always.
Okay.
And with very specific locations on the land.
Yeah.
And then they're also named after the covenant.
Okay.
So, and long-term respect, helping of each other, respecting each other's resources, resource sharing. They also give sharing and there's people alliances.
Okay. Okay. So let's all point the finger at the British Crown.
And I don't think
Yeah.
people have got time for the voting.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not sure what you're studying, but yeah. Yes.
Yeah, different path.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm impressed the work that you've been doing with the school divisions, and you're talking with a lot of younger people. I'm wondering what your impression has been in terms of dealing with the kids, and if you're getting a better understanding and following from the kids, which may have been better than what the adults and generations before have been.
Good question. When I'm in your schools, I try not to play the blame game, right? And I teach age-appropriate information. My stories are not about blaming anybody for anything. And I know there's people that want to apologize and want my forgiveness. That's not for me to do. That's not what this is about. This is about trying to have that better understanding and looking at the original intent of the secret treaty that we made. And let's see if we can find a little ways back there. Okay. So when I do talk in schools and when I teach kids, and I go from kindergarten all the way up to university, I always make sure that I don't want you to look at me as a victim. I don't want that. That's not what this is about. I don't want to guilt anybody. That's not what this is about. History shouldn't do that. Right? Was that a warning light to get out? Oh, okay. Yeah, it's not about that. Now, one of the other things that I try not to do is discuss your belief system. That's none of my business. And I don't discuss my beliefs with you either, my spirituality. That's none of your business either. When I speak in your churches and stuff like that, I don't speak in where your preacher talks from. I have too much respect for that. I don't do things like that. When I talk to your kids, when I talk to your grandchildren, I teach them about who I am. Firstly, me as a person. And secondly, I'll share different stories with them. Because there's all kinds of stories for different age children that you can tell. And it still tells the story about the Ojibwe people that were here, or other indigenous people. So thanks for that question. Yep. Deer in the headlights. Thank you very much. There's one coming up here. You just had to do that, didn't you?
I don't have to. I can
No,
sit
go
back
ahead,
down.
ask the question. I'm kidding you.
I have two questions, actually.
Yeah.
So one is, I'm not from Manitoba, so, but my ancestors have settled in Canada many hundred years ago, and it's been an ambition of mine and there's like 5 at least different branches that settled in different places. It would be my ambition to find out what happened, what was the relationship between my ancestors who settled here and the people who were already here. But I don't know how to find that out.
Yeah.
So how
the creation of a treaty or covenant, whichever way you want to look at it, it means that we started off on the right foot. The intention was good, right? But a lot of things got in the way. British common law. the Indian Act, property rights, those kinds of things got in the way. When the allocation of the eastern and western reserves was the one that broke the treaty. And it was with Shishibans and Wakuwash that broke the treaty. They said we can't, it's not fair. The words, I think in my speech, it said, the words of the light-skinned people are not honest, is the way they interpreted that word. So that's why that treaty was broken. But I think it's far more, I think it's important now that we think about that opportunity that we had to work together, to learn from each other. And I think that was what the people that were here before intended, even the ones that brought us here. That's what they intended, is that we will learn from each other. Plus we had a big army. That was another stick. Yeah, okay, go on with your next question.
Is it possible?
Did I answer that, by the way? Okay.
Is it possible to make things right with the broken treaty, agreement, covenant, whatever you want to call it?
Is it possible to make it right? Probably we're not going to go back to the 1800s. We're not. But I'll give you this. Look at me as a human being first. Let's start there. Right? Let's all start there. I look at you all as human beings first. That's my law. And I have to believe that because I believe in the spirituality of my people. So that's a good place to start. There's still a response.
That was
okay,
a good
your
answer.
next one? No?
Just two.
Oh, that's it. Okay, good. Yeah, I think that's, there's a whole teaching about that word of Imadizi. That's the first law of our people and the basis of our spirituality. And then it applies to the different societies. Like I come from the Sundance Society, but I'm also part of the Horse Society and the Plant Society, right? Because those are my areas of special knowledge, and those are the things that they really made me focus in on. Yeah. But like I said, let's start by just looking at that. Let's just start doing that. Teach your kids to do that. I'm teaching mine, right? I will say this one thing. I am disturbed by land acknowledgement. To me, it's a colonialistic way of speaking about land. Even the words that they told us to use, the national office sent me a letter, we have to start using the word indigenous. Well, if you were born here, you're indigenous. I don't like labels like that. I don't like the political words that are being thrown around. First Nation. How does that make you feel, right? I'm an Indian that lives on an Indian reserve. That's who I am, and that's where I live. I'm still landless in this country. The Crown still owns the land that I live on. I only occupy the reserve that I am in. Right? So when you say these things, it gives me a responsibility that I cannot have because of what I believe. So I don't like land acknowledgement. All my grandkids that live here in the city, I don't let them go into those classes when they're doing that. I don't allow them to make political statements like that. I don't like the idea, but hey, somebody smarter than me decided that that's what they need to say. I don't like guilting people into anything. If we do that, we're not going to go anywhere. If we keep doing that, and you guys looking at me as a victim, I don't want that either. I'm not a victim. Right? I got along in this life, and I've had a really good life. So, you were right there, so you guys didn't kill me. Neither did the French, my French neighbors, or my Belgian neighbors, or my Dutch neighbors. I lived with them all of my life. And I continue to live with them. and I continue to appreciate them very, very much. Anything else? Oh, I did it again, eh? Okay, I want to thank you again. I've got a long drive.
Thanks so much. Books are available over there. Thanks again to Common Word. Thanks to all of you. Jonathan Neufeld, who works for Mennonite Church Canada, Indigenous Relations, will wrap things up for us tonight.
Thank you, and thank you again for offering a long-standing truth that can become a new foundation for relations going forward. That's focused on strengths and assets and humanity and dignity and mutuality and respect. Thank you for inviting us to walk in that way from here. I will send us out with a poem that was written by Sean Friesen after the first Secret Treaty tour that we did in southern Manitoba, July 3rd, 2024. Secret Treaty. Its whisperings of truth held safe, secure, in the ancient language of the keepers, where story reigns eternal and the drum invites new life into being. We knew your people, the barefoot and bearded ones, when they cowered in fear at our presence. We knew your ways to be strange yet peaceful. You did not swear on books. Your word was good enough. We agreed, sealed it with the ceremony of sacred touch. Together we would share the land. With you it would be different. Together we would write the unfolding story of the land. Your words and their promise were soon forgotten. The land ravaged by your arrogance and avarice, its original teachings and abundance disdained, dishonored, discarded, her sacred beings exiled to the ditches and edges of Metlilina. You have abandoned the sacred, she weeps. You do not hear her cries. Her stories of loss and sorrow remain untold. Your souls roam the gray, restless landscapes of honor lost. When we needed you, you hardened your hearts. When our children needed you, when they came for them, you turned away from us, from your Jesus, and turned your face to a God of prosperity and wrath and judgment. And from the place where stories live until their telling, whispered stirrings called to those who had honored them, kept them safe. Armed with the language and humility, he stepped forth. I will speak, I will tell the stories to those who will listen, I will help them remember the agreement. And those with ears to hear listened, at first with ears only, then with their hearts open. Creator's song, earth's song, hope's song, pulsing through their veins. Go in peace.